The dawn arrived slowly in Austin, and with it the familiar knot in Emily's stomach. Her nimble fingers raced across the sewing machine as she tried to finish another repair before Michael woke up. The rhythmic sound of the needle piercing the fabric was like a countdown. Each stitch brought her closer to the moment her husband would come down the stairs, with that look she knew so well. Ethan, her 5-year-old son, was still asleep in the next room. It was in these moments of silence that Emily allowed her thoughts to wander, imagining a life different from the one she led. But she quickly shook her head, pushing those ideas away. Her mother always said a good wife doesn't question her fate. The creak of the wooden stairs made her heart race. Michael was coming down, and she could feel his piercing gaze before she even saw him. "Is the coffee ready?" he asked in that voice that brooked no hesitation. Emily stood up quickly, leaving the dress she was sewing half-finished. "Yes, I just made it," she replied, walking toward the kitchen. Her movements were calculated, as if stepping through a minefield. Every gesture was measured, every word weighed before being spoken. The routine unfolded like a dance rehearsed for years. Michael drank his coffee in silence, flipping through the newspaper, while Emily prepared his lunch for work. The only sounds were the clinking of the spoon against the cup and the occasional impatient sigh from Michael when something in the paper displeased him. "Who was that man talking to you at the door yesterday?" Michael asked suddenly, without taking his eyes off the newspaper. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "It was just Mr. John dropping off a few more pieces for repair," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "His wife needs the dresses for the weekend." Michael slowly lowered the newspaper, his eyes fixed on her. Did it really require so much conversation just to deliver some clothes? Before Emily could respond, Ethan's crying echoed through the house. She silently thanked the interruption and hurried upstairs to tend to her son. In the bedroom, she held the boy tightly, as if he were her only anchor in a turbulent sea. The rest of the morning passed in its usual stifling routine. Michael left for work, not without reminding Emily that he expected dinner to be ready when he returned. The hours dragged on between sewing, caring for Ethan, and household chores. Every minute was filled with a growing sense of inadequacy, as if she were wearing clothes 2 sizes too small. In the afternoon, while folding sheets on the clothesline, Emily noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Mary, watering her plants. The elderly woman always greeted her with a sad smile, as if she perfectly understood what went on behind the walls of that house. "My dear," Mrs. Mary called softly, "you know you can count on me, don't you?" Emily simply nodded, swallowing, the lump forming in her throat. The neighbor's comforting words were like raindrops in a desert, welcome but insufficient to change her reality. The sun was beginning to set when Michael arrived home earlier than usual. There was something different in his expression, a chill even colder than usual. Emily felt the air grow heavier like before a storm. "We need to talk," he announced, dropping his briefcase on the table with a dull thud. Emily remained still, her hands gripping the dish towel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I got an interesting call today," Michael continued, his voice laced with a threatening calm. "It seems you've been doing more than just sewing for the neighbors." Emily's heart raced. She didn't understand what he was talking about, but she knew that tone all too well. It was the same one that preceded his outbursts of anger, his baseless accusations, his silent punishments that lasted for days. "I only do the repairs people ask me to do," she tried to explain, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing more than that. Don't lie to me." Michael raised his voice, making Emily instinctively flinch. "You think I don't know about your plans, your conversations, your attempts to get money behind my back?" The accusations were absurd, but Emily knew it was no use arguing. Years of living together had taught her that the truth mattered little when Michael was convinced of something. Ethan, frightened by the shouting, began to cry in his room. The sound seemed to infuriate Michael even more. "Make that boy shut up," he ordered, slamming his fist on the table. It was at that moment that something inside Emily began to change. Her son's crying was like a call, awakening a strength within her that she didn't know she possessed. Her hands still trembled, but her gaze gained a new firmness. "I'll check on our son," she said, surprising herself with the calm in her voice. As she climbed the stairs, she could feel Michael's furious gaze on her back, but for the first time in years, she didn't care. In the room, she hugged Ethan, whispering words of comfort in his ear. The boy gradually calmed down, his sobs fading into a quiet breath. Emily stayed there, rocking her son, while listening to Michael's heavy footsteps downstairs. Night fell over Austin, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to reflect the mood inside that house. Emily remained in the room with Ethan, pretending not to hear the veiled threats Michael uttered downstairs. Each word he spoke was like a stone being added to the wall that imprisoned her, but for the first time, she began to see cracks in that seemingly impenetrable structure. As she watched her son sleep, Emily allowed her silent tears to fall. They were no longer just tears of sadness or fear. There was a newfound determination in them, an understanding that this life wasn't all there was. The world beyond those walls was beginning to call to her, even if she didn't yet know how she would answer that call. The clock showed almost midnight when Michael's screams finally ceased, replaced by the sound of the television turning on. Emily remained awake, her thoughts a whirlwind of fears and possibilities. Tomorrow would be another day, and she knew things couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to change, even if she didn't yet know exactly what or how. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching us from, and stay tuned. The sun had barely risen when Emily woke up, her muscles aching from sleeping in an uncomfortable position next to Ethan. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on her mind as she quietly descended the stairs. To her surprise, Michael was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with an expression she had never seen before. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice strangely controlled. Emily obeyed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the ticking of the wall clock. "It's over," Michael finally said, his words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "I want you out of this house today." Emily blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. "What do you mean?" she managed to stammer, her voice barely audible. "You heard me," he replied, his tone icy. "I don't want you here anymore. Take your things and the boy and leave." The reality of the situation began to hit her in waves. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly disappeared. "But where will I go?" she asked, more to herself than to him. "I don't care," Michael stood up abruptly. "You have until I get back from work to be out of here." With those words, he grabbed his briefcase and left, slamming the door hard enough to make the windows rattle. Emily remained seated, motionless, for several minutes, her world crumbling around her. Ethan's crying brought her back to reality. Climbing the stairs like an automaton, she went to her son's room, her mind a whirlwind of disjointed thoughts. The boy looked at her with his big brown eyes, oblivious to the storm brewing. "Mommy, I'm hungry," he said, rubbing his sleepy little eyes. Those simple words awakened something in Emily. Her son needed her, and she needed to act. With a determination she didn't know she possessed, she began moving around the room, grabbing clothes and essential items. Her hands trembled as she filled a backpack with Ethan's clothes and some of her own. Each piece she folded was accompanied by memories of the years lived in that house, some sweet, others bitter, all now tinged with the urgency of the moment. In the kitchen, she quickly prepared breakfast for Ethan, forcing herself to stay calm in front of him. "We're going on an adventure today, my love," she said, trying to smile as she watched him eat. The morning was moving quickly, and Emily knew she needed to make decisions. Her family wasn't an option. Her parents had always been the type who believed that, in a fight between husband and wife, no one should interfere. Her friends. What friends? Michael had made sure she drifted away from all of them over the years. With the backpack on her shoulders and Ethan in her arms, Emily closed the door of the house for the last time. The sun in Austin was already high, and the streets were starting to come alive. A few neighbors watched her from their windows, but no one dared to approach. Walking without a clear destination, Emily felt the weight of every step. Ethan, excited by what he believed was an adventure, pointed at everything he saw, asking questions she answered automatically. Her savings were meager, just what she had managed to hide from her sewing jobs. The hours dragged on, and the heat began to become unbearable. Emily stopped in a square to rest and give Ethan some water. Sitting on the bench, she watched people passing by, each immersed in their own lives, oblivious to the drama she was living through. It was then that she spotted an elderly woman selling coconut water. Something in the woman's kind expression made her stand up and approach. "Do you know of any place to rent? Something very simple," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Grace, looked at her and Ethan with understanding eyes. "My dear, everything around here is very expensive, but—" She paused as if considering something. "I know a place that might work, at least for now." Mrs. Grace explained about an old cabin on the land of a man named Ryan, a bit outside the city. "It's been abandoned for years, but it has a roof and walls. It's not much, but it's better than nothing," she said, sketching an improvised map on a napkin. With a direction to follow, Emily felt a small thread of hope. She thanked the woman and, adjusting Ethan in her arms, began walking out of the city. The sun was starting to set when she finally spotted the cabin. It was a simple mud structure with a thatched roof that had seen better days. The windows were just holes in the wall and the door hung precariously from its hinges. But for Emily at that moment, it seemed like a palace. Carefully, she entered the cabin. The interior was dusty with spider webs in the corners, but the floor was dry and the walls seemed sturdy. Ethan, tired from the long walk, fell asleep as soon as she improvised a bed with the clothes they had brought. Sitting on the dirt floor, watching her son sleep, Emily finally let her tears fall. They were no longer just tears of despair. There was also relief, fear, and surprisingly, a small spark of hope. The sound of crickets and the gentle wind coming through the cracks created a strangely comforting melody. There, in that cabin. The first night in the cabin was a test of endurance for Emily. The wind whistled through the cracks in the clay walls, bringing with it the cold of the early morning in Austin. Ethan slept deeply, wrapped in the few clothes they had managed to bring while she kept watch, her thoughts oscillating between fear of the unknown and the strange sense of freedom she was beginning to feel. Dawn brought with it a different kind of light, streaming through the holes in the roof and illuminating the interior of the cabin in an almost magical way. Emily watched the sunbeams dance on the dirt floor, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories of hope. Carefully, so as not to wake Ethan, she got up and began to explore her new shelter more thoroughly. In the daylight, the cabin revealed its secrets. It was larger than it had seemed the night before, with a main room and a small annex that could serve as a kitchen. The walls, though old, were sturdy, built with the wisdom of ancient clay masters. The roof, though in need of repairs, still fulfilled its basic function of protection. Ethan woke up with the sun already high, his curious eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mommy, where are we?" he asked, his voice still sleepy. "This is our new home, my love," replied Emily, trying to convey a sense of security she didn't fully feel yet. "We'll make it really nice, you'll see." With the boundless energy of a child, Ethan quickly turned the exploration of the cabin into an adventure. Every corner he discovered was a new source of wonder. Every abandoned object became a treasure in his fertile imagination. Emily watched her son, grateful for his ability to find joy even in the most challenging circumstances. The morning was dedicated to basic cleaning. With dry branches found nearby, Emily improvised a broom and began sweeping the dirt floor. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of sewing, now adapted to more rustic tasks. Each movement was an act of claiming that space, a silent declaration that this would be their new beginning. In the early afternoon, as she organized the few belongings they had brought, Emily heard voices approaching. Her heart raced, the fear that Michael might have found her freezing her movements for a moment. But the voices were different, unfamiliar. "Hello, is anyone there?" called a male voice, firm but not threatening. Emily hesitated, pulling Ethan close to her. Through the slightly open door, she saw a tall man with a rugged appearance but kind eyes. Beside him was a woman she recognized immediately. It was Grace, the coconut water seller who had pointed her to the cabin. "Don't be afraid, my dear," said Grace, her voice filled with kindness. "This is Ryan, the owner of this land. I came with him to see how you were settling in." Ryan took a step forward, maintaining a respectful distance. His eyes scanned the cabin with interest, but without judgment. "Grace told me about your situation," he said, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his stature. "The cabin has been abandoned for years, but it's a good place. It needs some repairs, but the walls are strong." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes but held them back. "I'm sorry for trespassing on your property," she began, but Ryan gently interrupted her with a wave of his hand. "No need to apologize. This land has enough space for those who need a fresh start," he said, a small smile forming on his lips. "If you'd like, you can stay. I just ask that you let me help with the necessary repairs. I can't let a woman and a child live in a place that might not be safe." Ryan's offer was more than Emily could have hoped for. It was the first time since she had left home that someone had extended a hand without asking for anything in return. The genuine kindness in their eyes made her lower her defenses a little. "I brought some things for you," said Mrs. Grace, revealing a basket she was carrying. Inside were bread, fruit, a bit of dried meat, and, to Ethan's delight, some sweets. It's not much, but it helps to get started. The rest of the afternoon was dedicated to planning the necessary improvements to the cabin. Ryan, who was well versed in working with clay and wood, explained what needed to be done. Emily listened attentively, absorbing every detail, every suggestion. Her mind, once occupied only with worries and fears, was now filled with possibilities. Ethan, who had initially remained shy and reserved, gradually began to open up. Ryan had a special way with children, and soon the two were talking about the different types of birds that visited the area. The boy laughed at the stories Ryan told, his laughter echoing through the cabin in a way Emily hadn't heard in a long time. As the sun began to set, Ryan and Mrs. Grace prepared to leave. "Tomorrow I'll come back with the tools and materials we need," Ryan promised. "We'll turn this place into a real home." After they left, Emily sat down with Ethan to share the simple dinner Mrs. Grace had brought. The bread was fresh, and the fruit was sweet. More than the food, it was the taste of hope that made that meal special. At night, lying next to Ethan, Emily reflected on the events of the day. The kindness of strangers had illuminated her path when everything seemed dark. It was as if the universe was conspiring to show that her decision to leave, though painful, had been the right one. The wind continued to whistle through the cracks, but now its sound seemed different. It was no longer a threat, but a lullaby that cradled her dreams of a fresh start. There, in that simple mud cabin, Emily began to understand that true strength wasn't about enduring suffering in silence, but having the courage to seek a better life. The following days brought a new routine to the cabin. Ryan kept his promise, arriving early with tools and materials for repairs. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the silence that once dominated the place, while the scent of wet earth and fresh wood filled the air. Emily discovered a skill within herself she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands, once dedicated only to the delicacy of sewing, now learned to work with mud and straw. Ryan was a patient teacher, explaining each step of the restoration process with a clarity that made everything simpler. "The secret is in the mix of the mud," he explained, kneading the earth with his feet, adding just the right amount of water. "You have to find the exact point, not too soft, not too hard. It's like life, you know? We need to find balance." Ethan watched everything, with fascination, his small hands always ready to help. Ryan had given him the important task of being the water supervisor, responsible for letting them know when the mixture needed more liquid. The boy took his work very seriously, his concentration drawing smiles from the adults. As the walls were reinforced and the roof repaired, the cabin began to take on a new life. The gaps were filled with a special mixture of clay and straw, keeping out the cold wind. The windows, once just holes in the wall, were fitted with wooden frames and simple yet effective locks. "You have a knack for this," Ryan remarked one day, watching Emily smooth a freshly repaired wall. "Your hands are precise, careful." She smiled, feeling her face flush slightly at the compliment. It was strange how Ryan's kind words affected her. After years of hearing only criticism and disapproval from Michael, any sign of recognition felt almost surreal. Mrs. Grace's visits also became more frequent. The lady always brought something with her. Sometimes food, sometimes used but well-kept clothes, and sometimes just stories and advice. Her presence was like a balm, bringing with it the wisdom that only years can provide. "You know, my dear," she said one afternoon, while helping Emily organize a small garden beside the cabin, "sometimes we need to get lost to find ourselves. What seems like a misfortune today could be the door to something better tomorrow." The lady's words echoed in Emily's mind as she worked. Each day brought small victories: a new improvised piece of furniture, a finished wall, a more frequent smile from Ethan. The cabin, which had once been just an emergency shelter, was beginning to transform into a home. It was during this period of transformation that Emily began to notice changes in herself. Her body, once always tense and hunched, now moved with more ease. Her voice, which used to be just a whisper, gained strength and presence. It was as if every piece of the cabin she helped rebuild also rebuilt a little of her own identity. One morning, while preparing coffee using the small wood stove Ryan had installed, Emily caught herself humming, something she hadn't done in years. The simple melody echoed through the clay walls, and Ethan, who was playing on the floor with some toy cars Ryan had given him, smiled as he heard his mother. "Are you happy, Mommy?" he asked, with the innocence of a child. The question caught Emily off guard. Happy? It was a word that hadn't been part of her vocabulary for a long time. But there, in that moment, with the sun streaming through the new windows and the smell of coffee in the air, she realized that yes, she was beginning to discover a different kind of happiness. "I am, my love," she replied, her voice steady and sincere. "We're building our new life here." The work on the cabin continued, but Emily knew she needed to think about how to sustain herself in the long term. Her savings, though modest, wouldn't last forever. That's when she had an idea. Watching the care with which Ryan treated the property and the way the cabin was becoming cozy, she began to imagine possibilities. One afternoon, while they rested after a day of work, Emily gathered the courage to share her thoughts with Ryan. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice still a bit hesitant, "that maybe we could turn this cabin into something more, a place where other people in need could find shelter, even if just for a few nights." Ryan looked at her with interest, his eyes shining with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Go on," he encouraged. "I know it might sound crazy," Emily continued, the words now flowing more easily, "but I've seen so many women in the city needing a safe place to stay. We could create a small refuge, something simple but welcoming." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Ryan gazed at the horizon, thoughtful as the sun began to set, painting the sky with orange hues. Finally, he turned to her with a smile. "You know," he said, "ever since I inherited this land from my father, I've always wanted it to serve something greater than just farming. Your idea, it has purpose." Ryan's words ignited a spark of hope in Emily. It was more than just approval. It was validation that her dreams of rebuilding weren't confined to the clay walls of the cabin, but could extend to helping others who, like her, needed a fresh start. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Emily stayed awake for a long time, planning. Her thoughts, once always focused on day-to-day survival, now expanded to greater possibilities. The cabin could be more than a refuge. It could be a symbol of hope and transformation. Weeks turned into months, and the cabin flourished under the dedicated care of Emily and Ryan. What was once just an idea began to take shape. A small refuge for women in need of help and support. The transformation was not just physical. Each new guest brought with them stories that echoed in Emily's own history. The first to arrive was Sophia, a young mother with 2 small children. Grace found her at the Austin bus station, disoriented and with nowhere to go. When she arrived at the cabin, Sophia could barely speak. Her eyes filled with the same fear Emily knew so well. "You're safe here," Emily said, helping her settle the children. The words came naturally, filled with an understanding that only someone who had lived through a similar situation could have. "This is a place to start over." Ryan had adapted the space, building partitions of bamboo and clay to create small individual rooms. Each space, though simple, offered privacy and dignity to the women who arrived. The wood stove, now larger, allowed several people to cook together, turning meals into moments of sharing and healing. Ethan thrived in this environment of solidarity. The children who arrived with their mothers became his playmates, and he showed a surprising sensitivity for his age, always ready to make the newcomers feel welcome. One afternoon, as she watched the children playing in the yard, Emily realized how much her life had changed. The constant fear that once consumed her had been replaced by a sense of purpose. Her hands, which once trembled at the slightest sound, now moved with confidence, whether sewing clothes for the guests or helping maintain the cabin. "You've created something special here," Ryan said, approaching quietly. He had just installed another window, expanding the common area of the cabin. His face was sweaty from work, but his eyes shone with satisfaction. Emily felt the familiar warmth in her chest that Ryan's presence always provoked. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something she still couldn't name, or perhaps was afraid to name. It was different from anything she had ever experienced, a feeling built on mutual respect, understanding, and admiration. "We created," she corrected, allowing herself a small smile. "None of this would have been possible without you." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Grace, who brought news from the city. The woman, who had become a sort of messenger between the refuge and the outside world, seemed worried. "My dear," she began after Emily led her inside, "I need to tell you something. Michael has been asking questions around town. He's looking for you and Ethan." The mention of Michael's name made Emily freeze. It was as if a dark cloud had covered the sun that had been shining until then. Her first instinct was to look at Ethan, who continued playing, oblivious to the adults' conversation. "He can't find us," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. Michael's voice, which she hadn't heard in so long, echoed in her memory, bringing with it all the memories she had tried to leave behind. Ryan stepped forward, his presence solid and comforting. "He won't find them," he stated with a certainty that made Emily feel safer. "This land is vast, and few know the way here. Besides," he added, his tone softening, "you're not alone anymore." Ryan's words brought a new kind of strength to Emily. She looked around at the cabin they had built together, at the women who had found refuge there, at Ethan, who was growing up happy and free. No, she wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. In the days that followed, Emily redoubled her efforts to make the refuge even more welcoming. Each new woman who arrived brought different skills, and soon the cabin turned into a small hub of activity. Mary, one of the guests, was a teacher and began giving lessons to the children. Anna, who had fled a difficult relationship, knew about medicinal herbs and started a therapeutic garden. Ryan watched these transformations with a mix of pride and admiration. He saw in Emily a strength she was still discovering. The timid, frightened woman who had arrived months ago was now leading a project that was transforming lives. One night, after everyone had settled in, Emily found Ryan sitting on the bench he had built himself on the porch. The stars shone brightly in the Austin sky, and the air was scented with the fragrance of wildflowers. "Sometimes I wonder," she began, sitting beside him, "what my life would have been like if I hadn't found this place, if I hadn't found you." Ryan remained silent. For a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You know," he finally said, "before you came, this land was just land. Now she has life. She has purpose." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Emily felt her heart race, not from fear as before, but from a different, deeper emotion. It was as if every step she had taken, the pain, the courage, the transformation, had prepared her for this moment. "Ryan," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. But before she could continue, a noise from the road interrupted the moment. Car headlights cut through the darkness, approaching the cabin. Emily's heart raced again, this time with a familiar icy fear. Ryan stood up quickly, instinctively positioning himself between Emily and the approaching headlights. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'll see who it is." Emily watched Ryan walk toward the light of the headlights, his strong silhouette outlined against the night. Inside the cabin, everything was silent. The women and children slept, unaware of the tension building outside. The car stopped a few meters from the house, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then the door opened and a figure emerged from the darkness. Emily felt her blood run cold as she recognized the familiar silhouette. It was Michael. The world seemed to stop for an instant. All the progress she had made, all the strength she had gained, seemed momentarily threatened by the mere presence of that man who had once controlled every aspect of her life. But something was different. The Emily who trembled before Michael no longer existed. In her place was a woman who had learned to build not just walls of clay, but also her own strength. The night air in Austin seemed to have frozen as Michael approached the cabin. His steps were heavy, laden with the authority he had always used to intimidate. Ryan stood firm between him and the house, his posture calm but resolute. "Where is my wife?" Michael's voice cut through the night silence like a sharp knife. "I know she's here with my son." Emily, still on the porch, felt a shiver run down her spine. It was the same voice that had kept her submissive, controlled for years. But now something was different. The fear was still there. But something stronger was growing inside her. "Michael," Ryan replied with surprising calm, "this is private property. It's not the time for visits." Michael took another step forward, his face partially illuminated by the car's headlights, revealing an expression of contained anger. "I don't care what time it is. I came to take what's mine." It was at this moment that Emily felt her legs move. Before she realized it, she was descending the steps of the porch, walking toward the two men. Her voice, when she spoke, surprised everyone with its firmness. "I am not your property, Michael. I never was." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at her, his eyes wide with surprise. Clearly, he had not expected to encounter this version of Emily, upright, confident, in control of herself. "What have they done to you?" he asked, his voice wavering between anger and disbelief. "This isn't you, Emily. You need to come back. Home, Ethan needs his father." "This is my home now," Emily replied, taking another step forward, "and Ethan is right here, growing up free and happy without fear." The words seemed to hit Michael like a physical blow. He looked around at the cabin illuminated by the soft light coming from inside, at the well-kept garden, at the clothes on the clothesline, signs of an organized and peaceful life that he couldn't comprehend. "You can't do this," he insisted, his voice now louder. "You can't just leave and build a life without me. Who do you think you are?" "She is a strong and brave woman," Grace's voice sounded behind them. The lady had arrived quietly, alerted by one of the women from the shelter. "And she is not alone." As if responding to Grace's words, several women began to emerge from the cabin. They were the guests of the shelter, each carrying their own story of overcoming. They positioned themselves silently behind Emily, forming a human barrier of solidarity. Michael looked at the group of women, then at Ryan, and finally at Emily. Something in his demeanor began to change. The arrogance that had always characterized him seemed to wither in the face of that silent demonstration of collective strength. "You've changed," he said, almost accusingly. "Yes, I have," Emily confirmed, her voice now softer, but no less firm. "I learned that I can be more than what you allowed me to be. I learned that I can build, create, help others. I learned that I deserve respect and true love." As she spoke these last words, her eyes met Ryan's for a brief moment. It was a look filled with meaning, with unspoken promises, with future possibilities. "And Ethan?" asked Michael, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "He needs his father." "Ethan needs love and security," replied Emily. "He needs examples of respect and kindness. If you want to be part of his life, you'll have to learn to offer that." The night seemed to hold its breath as Michael absorbed Emily's words. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the gentle wind swaying the leaves of the trees. "You can't stop me from seeing my son," he said finally. But his voice had lost its former authority. "No," agreed Emily. "I can't and I don't want to, but it will be on my terms, with respect and without violence. Ethan deserves that." It was at this moment that the cabin door opened once again, and Ethan appeared, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Upon seeing his father, the boy stopped, hesitant. "Dad?" he called, his small voice cutting through the tension of the night. Michael's face softened as he saw his son. For a moment, all his aggressive posture disappeared, replaced by something more vulnerable, more human. "Hi, son," he replied, his voice choked. Ethan looked at his mother as if asking for permission. Emily nodded slightly, and the boy descended the steps, cautiously approaching his father. "Why are you here so late?" asked Ethan, with the innocence typical of children. The simple question seemed to dismantle Michael's last defenses. He knelt down to his son's level, his eyes now even with the child's. I came to see how you were doing," he replied, his voice softer than Emily had ever heard. "I'm fine, Dad," said Ethan, smiling. "We have a cool house here. There are other kids to play with, and Uncle Ryan taught me how to make little clay houses." The mention of Ryan's name made Michael stiffen momentarily, but Ethan's genuine smile seemed to have the power to disarm his anger. Emily watched the scene with mixed emotions. Seeing father and son together after so long made her realize that love could exist even in the most complex situations. Perhaps the nighttime encounter with Michael marked a turning point in the lives of everyone involved. In the weeks that followed, a new dynamic began to take shape. Michael, stripped of his former arrogance, began a process of personal transformation. It wasn't easy, and often his controlling nature threatened to resurface, but the desire to maintain a connection with Ethan motivated him to change. Emily established clear rules for Michael's visits. They would always take place during the day at predetermined times, and always with other people around. At first he resisted these conditions, but gradually began to understand that he was no longer in a position to make demands. Meanwhile, the refugee continued to grow and thrive. The news of a safe place for women in vulnerable situations spread throughout the region, and more people sought help. Emily, with the constant support of Ryan and Grace, transformed the cabin into a true center for shelter and recovery. One particularly significant morning began with Emily watching the sunrise from the cabin's porch. The sky in Austin was painted in shades of pink and orange, heralding another day of possibilities. Ryan joined her, bringing 2 cups of coffee. "Sometimes I wonder if all of this is real," said Emily, accepting the cup with a smile. "It feels like it was in another life that I arrived here, scared and hopeless." Ryan looked at her with that gaze that always made her feel special. "You've transformed not only your life, but the lives of so many others," he replied. "This place, as proof that it's possible to rise from the ashes." Inside the cabin, the sounds of waking up began to be heard. The women who had found refuge there started their daily routines. The smell of fresh bread came from the communal kitchen, where Sophia, now one of the project coordinators, taught other women how to make straw crafts. Ethan, who had grown a few inches in recent months, ran out the door, followed by other children. "Mom, today is market day," he exclaimed excitedly. The weekly market had become an important event for the refuge, where the women sold their crafts and produce from the community garden. Emily smiled at her son, amazed by his transformation. The shy and frightened boy had given way to a confident and joyful child. The regular visits from Michael, now more restrained and respectful, had contributed to this positive development. "You know," said Ryan, watching Ethan play, "when you first arrived here, I thought I was just offering temporary shelter. I never imagined I would find such a great purpose and such true love." Emily felt her heart race at his words. Over the months, their relationship had blossomed naturally, built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and admiration. It wasn't an overwhelming passion like in romance novels, but something deeper and more enduring. "You taught me that it's possible to love without fear," she replied, allowing herself to be vulnerable. "That true love doesn't hurt, control, or diminish. It strengthens, liberates, and helps us grow." Ryan gently took her hand, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. Together they watched the growing activity in the cabin's backyard. Women arranged their goods for the market. Children helped carry baskets, and Grace arrived with her traditional basket of fresh herbs. "I have a surprise for you," said Ryan, after a moment of comfortable silence. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Emily. Curious, she opened the envelope and found official documents. They were deeds to the land where the cabin was built, but not just for her. It was a donation to the foundation they had created together to manage the refuge. "Now it's official," Ryan explained, his eyes shining with emotion. "This place belongs to all the women who need it. It's a legacy we built together." Tears of happiness streamed down Emily's face. This gesture symbolized much more than a simple property transfer. It was the consolidation of a shared dream, the assurance that the work they had started would continue to benefit other women for generations. The day at the fair unfolded with its usual positive energy. Michael showed up at the agreed time to spend a few hours with Ethan, and Emily noticed with satisfaction that his presence no longer caused tension in the environment. He had learned to respect the established boundaries and was gradually rebuilding his relationship with his son in a healthier way. That evening, when the fair had ended and the cabin grew quiet, Emily gathered all the residents for a moment of celebration. Each one shared her story, her achievements, her dreams for the future. They were stories of overcoming, courage, and rebirth. "When I first arrived here," said Sophia, now a confident and independent woman, "I thought it was the end of everything. But I discovered it was just the beginning. This place isn't just a refuge, it's a starting point for a new life." Sophia's words echoed in the hearts of everyone present. Emily, seated between Ryan and Ethan, felt a deep gratitude for everything she had experienced. Her journey of pain had transformed into a story of hope and renewal. "What happened to that frightened woman who arrived here so many months ago?" Ryan asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. "She transformed," Emily replied, her voice filled with certainty. "Just as this cabin transformed from an emergency shelter into a home for so many people. Just as fear turned into courage and loneliness into community." Ethan, drowsy, rested his head on his mother's shoulder. "I'm glad we came to live here, Mom," he murmured before falling asleep. Emily gently stroked her son's hair, her heart overflowing with love. The future stretched out before her like an endless horizon of possibilities. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending. It was something better. It was real, built with sweat, tears, and above all, courage. The cabin, now much more than a simple mud structure, would continue to be a beacon of hope for women who, like her once, needed a place to start over. And Emily, alongside Ryan, Ethan, and the entire community they had built, would continue her journey, no longer as a silenced woman, but as a transformative force. Dear listeners, we hope Emily's journey has touched your hearts and inspired deep reflections on transformation and new beginnings. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories of overcoming and true love. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the power of personal transformation. Share your own stories of overcoming challenges in the comments. Every experience is unique and valuable. We look forward to seeing you in our next narrative.